So here we are in the second lesson of this series on proclaiming the unknown God, and we'll be going through to till the end of March here in this series. When I was at school, the Shakespeare play that we had to study for our O-level was Twelfth Night, and it's supposed to be a comedy, but for a 16-year-old who was more familiar with Dad's Army and Monty Python's Flying Circus, I didn't really get any of the jokes in it. But apparently it's a comedy, and one of the characters in the play is called Malvolio, and he is a steward in the household of the Countess Olivia. Malvolio is a pompous, self-important character who is tricked into thinking that the Countess is in love with him and wants to marry him. And he contemplates his elevation to the position of Count as he reads these words in a letter that he has been tricked into thinking that Olivia has sent to him. Some are born great, some achieve greatness, and some have greatness thrust upon them. And Malvolio thinks that he is one of those who is about to have greatness thrust upon him. Shakespeare's words on greatness there are often quoted, but how do we define greatness? What would make something or someone great? The greatness that we ascribe or attribute to people is often limited to just one sphere or one aspect of their work or their attainment. Someone may be a great sports person or a great singer or a great writer or a great political leader. They excel in their chosen field or their chosen profession. But no human being can become great at all things. Everyone has their limitations and their weaknesses. The word great is often used in a relative sense. We may speak of something which is great in size, or great in number, or great in importance, or great in intensity. So we use the word great as an adjective, and we might speak of the Great Fire of London, or we speak of someone like Alexander the Great. And before the Second World War came along, the First World War was called the Great War. One of the medals that was issued for those who'd participated in that war was inscribed with the words, "The Great War for Civilization." But what are we comparing these great things to when we speak of a great in this way? They're great in comparison to what? Is there an absolute standard of greatness to which we can compare all of these other things that we might call great? Compare the things that we call great, though, with the greatness of God, come to realize that human greatness is so little and so insignificant in comparison, and we really have no idea of the meaning of true greatness as it's seen in the greatness of God. In Job chapter 5 and verse 9, Eliphaz, who's one of Job's friends who've come along to comfort him in his suffering, tells Job that he would commit his cause to a God who does great things and unsearchable, marvelous things without number. And then he lists some of those great things. He says he gives rain upon the earth and sends waters upon the fields. He sets on high those who are lowly, and those who mourn are lifted to safety. So here are some of the great things that this great God does. God's actions and deeds are often described as being great. We have one example there in Psalm 126 and verse 3. The psalmist says, "They said among the nations, the Lord has done great things for them. The Lord has done great things for us. We are glad." The psalm is talking about the restoration of the fortunes of Zion, what God has done for his people, that the Lord has done these great things. Our God then is a great God, and he is declared as such. Psalm 48 and verse 1 says, "Great is the Lord, and greatly to be praised in the city of our God." So a great God is to be greatly praised. And in Psalm 95 and verse 3, here the psalmist says, "For the Lord is a great God and a great King above all gods." Words which are often sung, I think, in a familiar chorus. Psalm 35, verse 27, "Let those who desire my vindication shout for joy and be glad and say evermore, great is the Lord who delights in the welfare of his servants." God is great and demonstrates that greatness in so many ways, and his greatness is declared here in so many of these passages that we can read. The writer J.I. Packer asks the question, how may we form a right idea of God's greatness? The Bible teaches us two steps that we must take. The first is to remove from our thoughts of God limits that would make him small. The second is to compare him with powers and forces which we regard as great. So two things there that Packer says about how we can develop or form this idea of God's greatness. The first, remove from our thoughts any limitations that would make God small. Stop thinking of God in terms of what he can't do, or God's not interested in me. Remove those ideas from our thoughts. And then the second, compare him with those powers and forces that we already regard as being great. In Isaiah chapter 40, we are encouraged to do this, to take this second step as we contemplate the greatness of God by comparing the things that we consider to be great with the greatness of God himself. And this is the passage that we're going to be focusing upon this evening, Isaiah chapter 40, from verse 12 down to verse 31. It's a fairly long passage, but so we'll read through it here to begin with. Isaiah chapter 40, verse 12 to 31. "Who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand and marked off the heavens with a span, enclosed the dust of the earth in a measure, and weighed the mountains in scales and the hills in a balance? Who has directed the Spirit of the Lord, or as his counselor has instructed him? Whom did he consult for his enlightenment? And who taught him the path of justice, who taught him knowledge and showed him the way of understanding? Behold, the nations are like a drop from a bucket, and are accounted as the dust on the scales. Behold, he takes up the isles like fine dust. Lebanon would not suffice for fuel, nor are its beasts enough for a burnt offering. All the nations are as nothing before him. They are accounted by him as less than nothing and emptiness. To whom then will you liken God, or what likeness compare with him? The idol, a workman casts it, and a goldsmith overlays it with gold and casts for it silver chains. He who is impoverished chooses for an offering wood that will not rot. He seeks out a skillful craftsman to set up an image that will not move. Have you not known? Have you not heard? Has it not been told you from the beginning? Have you not understood from the foundations of the earth? It is he who sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them like a tent to dwell in, who brings princes to naught and makes the rulers of the earth as nothing. Scarcely are they planted, scarcely sown, scarcely has their stem taken root in the earth, when he blows upon them, and they wither, and the tempest carries them off like stubble. To whom then will you compare me, that I should be like him, says the Holy One? Lift up your eyes on high and see. Who created these? He who brings out their host by number, calling them all by name. By the greatness of his might, and because he is strong in power, not one is missing. Why do you say, O Jacob, and speak, O Israel, my way is hid from the Lord, and my right is disregarded by my God? Have you not known? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. He gives power to the faint, and to him who has no might he increases strength. Even youths shall faint and be weary, and young men shall fall exhausted. But they who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. This then is this wonderful passage here in Isaiah chapter 40, which you want to have a look at this evening. But this chapter, Isaiah 40, is addressed to people who are in distress and despair, people who need to hear a message of comfort and reassurance that things are going to get better. The chapter begins, looking at the context here, the chapter begins in verses 1 and 2, comfort. Comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and cry to her that her warfare is ended, that her iniquity is pardoned, that she has received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins. And then in verses 10 and 11 as well, behold, the Lord God comes with might, and his arm rules for him. Behold, his reward is with him, and his recompense before him. He will feed his flock like a shepherd. He will gather his lambs in his arms. He will carry them in his bosom and gently lead those that are with young. So the chapter begins then with this thought of God as a comforting and as a caring God. He's pictured there as being like this shepherd who gathers his lambs up in his arms, who carries them and leads them. He is one who is concerned about his people. So this is how the chapter begins. This is placing the passage in its context. And then Isaiah considers the greatness of God in relation to several things, in relation to the creation, to the nations of the world, to the people of the earth, and to the stars of the heavens. And when all of these realms and these spheres of activity are considered, we see greatness. But when we compare that greatness with the greatness of God, then we come to realize the insignificance of our own ideas of what greatness is and who is great. If we begin then by looking at God and the creation here, when we consider the world in which we live, we are impressed by the greatness of nature. We're filled with wonder and awe when we view the variety of animal and plant life that we find on this planet. And when we consider the natural features of this world, from mountains to plains, from lands that are covered in ice and snow, hot deserts, from the vastness of the oceans and the rivers and the lakes to the smallest of streams. There is, we can see great beauty in the natural world, which we can appreciate, either when we see it in person or when we watch nature programs on the television, like David Attenborough programs, a new series starting last night called The Green Planet, which looks at plant life on this planet. And you see the beauty of the creation that is around us. However, to see this world in its proper perspective, we have to consider the greatness of the one who created it. If we are impressed by the wonder and the greatness of the world around us, then how much more will we be impressed by the greatness of its creator? Here in Isaiah chapter 40, verses 12 to 14, we are asked to think about what God has done. In verse 12, the question is asked, who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand? When God created this world, it was as if he had measured out the water into the hollow of his hand. Can you imagine for a moment, if you cup your hand there and pour a drop of water into your hand there? Imagine all of the waters of the world, all of the waters contained in the oceans and the seas and the rivers and the lakes, sitting there in the hollow of your hand. And that's how God views the waters, as if he's measured out those waters by just putting that little drop of water into the hollow of his hand. And then he asks, who has marked off the heavens with a span? When we look up into the sky, or the firmament as it's referred to in Genesis chapter 1, we see this great expanse of sky. It's beyond our ability to comprehend the measurement of that. But to God, those same heavens, those same skies can be measured by the span of his hand. And the span is the distance that if you stretch out your hand, the span is the distance from the tip of the thumb to the tip of the small finger. That's the distance that God uses. That's how God measures out the sky that we see around us. Again, it impresses us with this comparison of ourselves to the greatness of God. And then he asks, who has enclosed the dust of the earth in a measure? From God's perspective, all of the dust of the earth can be contained in a measuring cup. You get hold of a measuring cup like this one, you can imagine filling it up with all of the soil and the earth and the sand and the dust, all of the soil on this earth filled into that little measuring cup. And that's how God looks upon all of the physical material of this earth, as if he's just filled up a little cup with it. And then he asks, who has weighed the mountains in scales and the hills in a balance? We might think of some of the great mountain ranges of this earth, like the Himalayas or the Rockies or the Alps. And we're impressed by the greatness and the height and the beauty of these formations. But to God, it's as if he could just put them all on his weighing scales or on his balances and weigh them out. Isaiah seems to be picturing God here as perhaps a baker or a builder, someone who is measuring things and weighing out things, weighing out ingredients, or measuring out the sand and the cement that as a builder would. And this image, thinking of God in this way in relation to the creation, this image conveys to us the greatness of God in relation to the physical world in which we live. But how was God able to do all of this? Through another series of questions, then Isaiah challenges us to reflect upon this greatness of God. In verses 13 and 14, he asks, who has directed the Spirit of the Lord, or as his counselor has instructed him? Whom did he consult for his enlightenment? And who taught him the path of justice, and taught him knowledge, and showed him the way of understanding? So how did God learn to do all of these things? If we want to learn a new skill, then somebody has to teach us those skills. We have to go to school or college or enter an apprenticeship. We learn and we go to more experienced people to help us and to give us instruction in these things. And even the most brilliant geniuses like Einstein or Mozart or Da Vinci had to start somewhere, had to be taught. So who taught God? Well, the implied answer to each of Isaiah's questions there in verses 13 and 14 is no one. No one directed God. No one instructed him. And no one showed him how to do these things, because God's knowledge is perfect and complete. He needs no one to teach him anything, which once again shows to us his greatness. Next, then we need to understand the greatness of God in relation to the nations of the world. Throughout human history, great civilizations have developed and achievements have been made in science and technology, in philosophy and in art. and in the understanding of life itself. We might think of some of the great empires or civilizations of the world from the past, Egypt and Babylon and Persia, Greece, Rome, China, and then the period of the Renaissance or the Industrial Revolution, and the modern developments in medicine and communication. And all of these civilizations and these movements have brought great advances in our knowledge and brought great benefits to mankind. In the time of Isaiah, it was the threat of the military might of the great nations of Assyria and Babylon that brought fear to the Jews. They looked upon those nations and their mighty armies with alarm and trepidation. A small nation like Israel or Judah seemed to be so insignificant in comparison to those other great nations. But how does God look upon those nations? In verse 15 here, Isaiah tells us, "Behold, the nations are like a drop from a bucket, and are accounted as the dust on the scales. Behold, he takes up the isles like fine dust." And then in verse 17, "All the nations are as nothing before him. They are accounted by him as less than nothing." So from God's perspective, these great human nations, these great civilizations with all of their achievements are like that last drop of water that always hangs around in the bottom of the bucket after you've emptied it out. You know, you wash the car or you wash the floor and you empty out the bucket of water, and there's always a little drop of water that's left there in the bottom. Well, that's how God sees these great nations. Or they're like that dust on the scales. You take the scales out of the kitchen cupboard and you haven't used them for a while, and there's a bit of a layer of dust on them, and it's so insignificant that it fails to register any weight on the scales at all. Again, that's how God sees these nations. In verse 16 there, Isaiah writes, "Lebanon would not suffice for fuel, nor are its beasts enough for a burnt offering." Lebanon was famous for its great cedar trees. All of the great cedars of Lebanon could not provide enough wood for fuel, nor would its animals provide enough for burnt offerings. This is all about scale and comparison, comparing what we see, how we see things, with how God sees these things. And what we see as being great and impressive is nothing to God. Today, God still regards the nations of the world in the same way. They are all still drops from the bucket and dusts on the scale, whether that's today China or Russia or the USA, all competing for world dominance. When Isaiah says here that the nations are as nothing before him and are accounted by him as less than nothing, he doesn't mean that God is uncaring or God is unconcerned about people. We saw how the chapter begins with an expression of God's care for his people, but rather it's a comparison of power and greatness. The power and the greatness of human nations and human civilizations are no match for the power and the greatness of God. What then can we compare God to? The question is asked in verse 18, "To whom then will you liken God? Or what likeness compare with him?" This God that Isaiah has been describing cannot be compared or reduced to an idol, as verses 19 and 20 make clear. Isaiah says, "The idol, the workman casts it, and a goldsmith overlays it with gold, and casts for it silver chains. He who is impoverished chooses for an offering wood that will not rot. He seeks out a skillful craftsman to set up an image that will not move." You can make your idol from the most precious material you can afford. You can employ the most skillful craftsman in the business to make it for you. but it will still be dead. It will not move, and it will not do anything. So how then could anyone compare such a thing to the living God, who has done all of these things that Isaiah has just spoken of? Last week, we saw that this was Paul's argument to the people of Athens in Acts chapter 17 and verse 29, when he reminded them, being then God's offspring, we ought not to think that the deity is like gold or silver or stone, a representation by the art and imagination of man. You can't do that. You can't limit God or restrict God or confine God to that idol that you have made. So having spoken then of the nations of the world and these great empires or civilizations, Isaiah now moves on to speak of the individual inhabitants of the world. How does God view the inhabitants or the people of this world? Again, there's a series of questions here in verses 21 and 22. Isaiah asks, have you not known? Have you not heard? Has it not been told you from the beginning? Have you not understood from the foundations of the earth? It is he who sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them like a tent to dwell in. Here, God is pictured as if he is seated above the circle of the earth, and he's looking down upon the inhabitants of the earth and seeing them like grasshoppers. From our perspective, we might feel very small in comparison to the size of this world in which we live, although travel and communication has made the world in a way a smaller place and made it easier for people to get around the world in a quicker way. But even so, the world is still a big place with a population now of nearly 8 billion people. And if we feel small in comparison to the world in which we live, then think of how small this world is in comparison to God, the greatness of God. He looks down upon the world and he sees us, its inhabitants, as being like grasshoppers. We can perhaps see things from that perspective when we perhaps go out into the garden and we look in the grass and we see the grasshoppers, or we see ants crawling around or other tiny insects. And it's as if we have that same perspective. As we are to those insects, so God is to us. Amongst mankind, there are those who rise to positions of power and greatness, leaders of nations who have an influence for good or bad upon the lives of millions of people. And today there are people of power and influence, not only in politics, but in business and in industry as well. These people can exert a great influence and control upon our lives. By their decisions, they shape the way that we live. But whatever power or greatness such people may have, it is nothing in comparison to the power and the greatness of God. And this is the comparison that Isaiah now makes in verses 23 and 24, when he speaks of God as the one who brings princes to naught and makes the rulers of the earth as nothing. Scarcely are they planted, scarcely sown, scarcely has their stem taken root in the earth, when he blows upon them and they wither, and the tempest carries them off like stubble. The princes and the rulers of this world here are likened to these short-lived plants. Their period of power is over before it has even begun, consigned to the history books and the museums. The people of power and influence in this world all end up in the same condition. They all die. They're all buried in tombs somewhere. And you can go to visit a place like Westminster Abbey And you can see the tombs of kings and queens of this land and other famous and influential people, but they've all ended up in the same place. But God is greater than the great men and the women of this world. Human power, human influence is temporary. It does not last. And when their time is up, God blows upon them and they are gone. They're carried off by the wind, Isaiah says. But God is not like these temporary, fallible human rulers, and he bears no comparison to them. In verse 25, again, the question is, God asks the question, to whom then will you compare me, that I should be like him? Are you going to compare me to these human rulers, these princes of the earth? So we must stop thinking that God is like us or that we are like God. So far, the comparisons drawn by Isaiah have focused upon the created world and the nations of the world and the people and the rulers of the world. But now Isaiah takes us beyond our own planet into the wider universe. In verse 26, he says, "Lift up your eyes on high and see. Who created these? He who brings out their host by number, calling them all by name. By the greatness of his might and because he is strong in power, not one is missing." God, through Isaiah, invites us to go outside and to look up into the night sky and to observe the stars. On a clear night in the darkness of the countryside, you can go and look up into the sky and be overwhelmed by the sight of so many stars. It's difficult to do that on a cloudy night, or if you're living in a city where there's the problem of light pollution. But if you get out into the countryside where there's that pitch darkness and it's a clear night, and just to look up into the sky and to be overwhelmed by the number of stars that you can see. And even with the aid of a powerful telescope, it would be impossible for us to count all of the stars. There are just billions and billions of them, separated from us by distances that are measured in light years. The Hubble telescope has sent back amazing pictures of the universe, and this new telescope that's just been put up there, James Webb telescope, they expect to be able to send back even more impressive photographs of the universe and amazing images of the universe. But God, the creator of these stars, knows just how many there are, and he has a name for each one of them. They're all under his control. There is a photo that is called a pale blue dot, which is a photograph of the planet Earth. This is it here. It was taken on the 14th of February 1990 by the Voyager 1 spacecraft, which had been launched in 1977. The photograph was taken at a distance of 4 billion miles from Earth. And the planet Earth appears as a tiny pale blue dot in the vastness of space. You can see it there on that lighter strip on the right-hand side, and then halfway along that lighter strip there, if you can just about make out a small dot, that is a photograph of the planet Earth. So here's a magnified section of that, which you can see a little more clearly there on the right-hand side, that pale blue dot. And to look at that photograph I find it really quite impressive, and thinking on that little dot, all of the people who have ever lived have been on that dot, and all of the events that have ever occurred in human history have taken place there on that little dot. And to see that is really a reminder of how tiny we are in comparison to the vastness of the universe and to the greatness of God. But Isaiah takes us into a new dimension of the greatness of God, that he is not a God who exists within the universe. He's not just one God who is looking down on one world, but he is a God who is transcendent, a God who is above and beyond the universe. And the amazing thing is that it is this God who cares for us. It is this God who wants to know us. When we think about the greatness of God, then, we may wonder that he could ever show any interest in us at all. The psalmist writes in Psalm 8, verses 3 and 4, "When I look at the heavens, the work of thy fingers, the moon and the stars which thou hast established, what is man that thou art mindful of him, and the son of man that thou dost care for him?" When we see pictures like that picture I've just shown of that pale blue dot, we wonder, why is God even interested in us? We seem so small, so insignificant in comparison to him. In verse 27 here, Isaiah asks, "Why do you say, O Jacob, and speak, O Israel, my way is hid from the Lord, and my right is disregarded by my God?" Israel's complaint was that God had abandoned them, that God had lost interest in them and didn't care for them. But this is not the case. Israel's complaint against God is answered now in verses 28 and 29. "Have you not known? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. He gives power to the faint, and to him who has no might, he increases strength. The Lord, the everlasting God, the creator of all things, is not one who grows weak or tired as we do. His power and his strength remain consistently the same. He is never more or less powerful. And from himself, he will supply power to those who are fainting, and he will give strength to those who are tired. Our own physical strength is partial and temporary. And even those who are in the prime of life, the youth and the young men, Isaiah says, shall faint and be weary. They shall fall exhausted. But in the Lord, we have a source of strength which will not fail us. In verse 31, the last verse of this chapter, Isaiah says, "But they who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint." And when we wait upon the Lord, trusting in him, meditating and reflecting upon his greatness, then he supplies us with the spiritual strength that we need. And so we become like the eagles that effortlessly soar through the skies, borne along by the currents of rising air. We do not become weary or faint because the source of our strength is the Lord himself, our great God. And so we need to continue to have these great thoughts about God, to contemplate and to meditate upon passages like this, which remind us of just how great God is, and to dispel from our thoughts those limitations that we would place upon God. Thank you for being here this evening, and thank you for listening. Next week, we shall be considering the unchanging God. That will be our lesson for next week.